What's up, everybody? Welcome back to One More Guitar. Hope you're doing good today. Thank you for checking out the channel. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe button if you're interested. So in last week's lesson, we learned how to play some rhythm with the chords that you've been working on so far, the open major chords. And I showed you a few patterns that you could play and told you that later I would explain to you how I came up with these patterns and why they work. So today we're going to dive into that a little bit. I'm going to talk about the major scale and how you can make chords from the major scale. And then today I'm going to focus only on the open chords because that's what we've been working on. If you haven't seen my video on the introduction to the major scale, I'll put a link above. Go check that out. It'll make this make a lot more sense. It might also be helpful to you to go check out the video about open major chords. So let's get into this. Alright, so before we get started, I want to recap the major scale just a little bit. So we can pick any note in the music alphabet and make that our root note, which is our starting point to construct the major scale. And to construct the major scale, we use the formula that I've shown you in a couple of videos now, where you go root, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Once you do that, you have all of the notes for the major scale. So from this point, we can look at these notes and we can start making chords from them. So if you remember, we've been creating chords from the major scale by starting with the root note and then skipping a note until we have at least 3 notes. We do that and we have the root chord of the key that we're playing in. And the key is defined by which note we picked, right? So if we picked A, we're in the key of A. So today I want to show you how to make other chords from the same scale using the same trick. I do want to make one clarification before we start though. We're picking a note and we are creating a scale from that note. So that note is our root note, and it is our starting note, and it is the root of the key. But just because that note is the root note doesn't always mean that the song has to start with that chord or that note. I just want you to know that. I don't want you to get confused later thinking that every song in a key has to start with the root chord of the key. That's not the case. But when we're looking at the major scale, the root note is always going to be the first note in our scale. Let's take a look at how to find chords in a key. So here's the musical alphabet for reference if you can read my wonderful handwriting. We're going to start with the key of G. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out the notes that are in the key of G major, and we'll start there. So here are the notes of the G major scale, and if you're not sure how I came up with these, check out my video on the introduction to the major scale. A card should be popping up right about now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the skip a note trick to find 3 notes that make up our chords. So we know if we start with G, we skip the A, take the B, skip the C, and take the D, we get our root chord of the G major scale, and that's the G major chord. So if we number each of these notes in the scale, we see that the root chord of the scale consists of the first, the third, and the 5th note of the scale. I wanted to take the time to point this out because the formula for a major chord is important and will come into play later. Next, what I want to show you is that you can apply the same skip a note pattern to any note in the scale and come up with a new chord. So we're going to start now with the second note of the scale, A, and we're going to make a chord from that. So we're going to skip the B, use the C, skip the D, and use the E. When you put those notes together, what you get is the A minor chord. Now I know we haven't talked about minor chords yet, and that lesson's coming up, but just know that you're going to get major chords or minor chords or diminished chord out of these scales by doing this skip a note trick. So right now we have a minor chord, and like I said, we'll talk more about that later, but just know that the second chord in a scale is minor. So let's move on and try the third chord of the scale. Again, we can do the same trick, so we're going to end up with a B, a D, and an F sharp note. So when you put these notes together, what you get is a B minor chord. So the third chord in a key is also minor. So today's lesson is really about the major chords in a key, but I wanted to show you how you can build any of the chords from any of the notes in the major scale. And if you do that, the first chord, the fourth chord, and the fifth chord of the key are always major. And the second chord, the third chord, and the sixth chord are always minor. That's very important. Take a second to remember that. So you may be asking, what about the seventh? Well, the seventh is a diminished chord. And we're not really going to talk about it a lot right now. I'll just, again, note what it is. We'll talk about it later in the future, but the seventh chord is a diminished, and we're not going to worry about it at the moment. So today, I just want to talk about the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. The 3 major chords that you build off of a major scale of a key. Okay, so we've already looked at how to make the 1, the 2, and the 3 chord. So how do we make the 4 chord? Well, we're going to do the same trick. We're going to start with the 4th note of the scale, which is C. Then we're going to do the skip a note trick to get C, E, and G. So now what we have are the notes of the C major chord. And the C major chord is the 4th chord of the G major scale. Now let's see if we can figure out the 5th chord of the G major scale. So we know the 5th note is D. So we'll take that as the first note, and then we do our skip a note trick, and we have F sharp. And you skip a note back to the beginning, and the G is the same, so you take the A. And now you have the D major chord, which is the 5th chord of the G major scale. So now we have all 3 of our major chords from the G major scale, and that's G for the 1st chord, the root, C for the 4th chord, and D for the 5th chord. Again, here are our 3 major chords for the key of G major. Alright, let's do another one. We'll do the key of A this time. So here we have the scale written out and numbered. We're going to go ahead and get the root. So doing our skip a note trick, we have A, C sharp, and E for A major. And can you guess what the next chord is going to be? We need to find the 4 chord. So D is the 4th note. So we're going to have a D major chord as our 4th chord. We know it's major because we know in our formula up here that 1, 4, and 5 are always major. So we have D, we have F sharp, and we have A. And you may notice those are the same notes that we found for D major when we were in the key of G. D major is always the same notes. So now let's look for the 5 chord. The 5th note is E, so we know we're going to make an E major chord. So we do our skip a note trick, and we get E, G sharp, and B. Alright, let's do one more to make sure you've got it. Here we have the notes for the key of D major. We know that the 1st chord, the root chord, is going to be D. If you remember from the key of A, we found that the notes for D major are D, F sharp, and A. And again, that's true here. So what's the 4 chord of the key of D major? It's G. Well, you should also remember that the notes for G are G, B, and D. And then the last chord in D major, the 5 chord, the last major chord I should say, is the 5 chord A, which is A major, and it's A, C sharp, and E. Again, you should remember this from when we did this in the key of A. Just want to drive home the fact that the notes of the chords are the same. Alright, so let's take a look at this with the guitar and see if we can put it into practice some. Okay, so now that we know how to get the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord from any major scale, let's play those chords together and just kind of play around a little bit and see what they sound like. So we'll start with the key of A, and we remember the chords. The 1 chord was A, the 4 chord was D, and the 5 chord was E. So we're going to start by just playing those in order and seeing how that goes. So we'll do a bar of A, a bar of D, a bar of E, and then back to A. Alright, so. See, those chords sound pretty good together. And the same is going to be true for any key. If you can figure out the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord, they're always going to sound good together. So another thing you can do is take them out of order. We don't have to start with the A chord. Let's start with the E chord. We'll go backwards. We'll go E, D, and A. So we'll do. You see how we kind of stayed on A at the end? That's because we're in the key of A, and A is the home. So it's less important about what chord you start with than maybe it is what chord you end with. Again, the ending chord and the beginning chord don't necessarily determine the key, but you kind of have a sense of where the home chord is, what you want to resolve to. So, and it's usually the root of the key, right? So in this case, we started with the E chord, but we ended on the A chord, and that really felt like we were at our home position, right? Back to A. All right, so that's how the root works. So next let's move to the key of G, find the 1, 4, 5 there, and play around with that a little bit. So we know the root is G, and if you remember from the whiteboard, the 4 chord is C, and the 5 chord is D. And if you remember back to last lesson, you'll remember that these are the chords that I told you to play together. Why? Because they go together. So let's try this out in G. We're going to go G, C, and D. And I'm just going to mess around with different rhythms and stuff just to give you an idea of how you can play around with the chords some. Okay, this time let's start with C. We're going to go C, G, D, G. And you can see from these examples that I'm always ending on the root chord, and I think you should do that for now too. I wanted to mention earlier that you don't have to do that, but for now, just try to do that. Keep it simple for yourself. All right, so let's look at one more key. We're going to look at the key of D. And the reason I picked these 3 keys is because the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord and these 3 keys are all open chords. And that's all we've gone over so far. So I wanted to show you things that you can use right now. So the last key we're going to look at is D. The root chord is D, which is the 1. The 4 chord is G, and the 5 chord is A. So let's just play around with that for a minute. Okay, we can start with different chords just like the other one. And you see how I threw in different rhythms there. I want you to play around with this. Have some fun with it. Do some crazy rhythms. You know, you don't have to change chords every bar. You can change chords multiple times in a bar. You can sit there and just play A for a while. So just have some fun with it. Play around with different rhythms. Hold chords longer than others. You know, play them fast. Play multiple chords per bar. Whatever, you know, have some fun. You might come up with something that's pretty cool. So if you're into blues, rock, country, bluegrass, a lot of those types of genres are built mainly on 1-4-5. Spend some time working on this. Play around with the chords. Play around with the rhythms. And, you know, really kind of understand how you can get the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord from any different key. That's really important. So I hope this was helpful to you. In the next lesson, I think I'm going to show you some songs that you can use all of this stuff I've shown you so far to play. So maybe I can get you going into playing some real songs. So until next time, take it easy and keep playing. And thank you for watching. Today we're going to talk about some chords that we can put together for the blah 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 blah.